Hello everybody, welcome back to more Sins of the Father. It's just going to be one chapter today. I've only got a little bit of time. I was holding off recording because I had a new headset that I hoped was going to turn up today, and it hasn't. It's been pushed back. But I wanted to get at least something up and just let everyone know I'm fine, I'm okay. I went down with a bit of a migraine yesterday morning. I'm a little bit fuzzy-headed, but I'm much better than I was, so thank you. I'm just gonna get into it. The last time when we left off, we were in Parker's perspective, and he had been informed by a Mr. Russell Beck that William Ford might have killed somebody. So yeah, we are back in Martha's perspective today, and we are gonna read chapter 20. Chapter 20. Outside of the oh-so-exclusive gentlemen's club, Martha was practically chomping at the bit. If there was one thing she hated, it was being disregarded because she was female. She'd dealt with it for years on the Mount, and had experienced it more than enough. If the pseudo-tough guy Dorman thought that he could intimidate her, then he should probably meet the males that she trained with. They would eat him for breakfast. Some of them perhaps literally. Henry White emerged from the club several minutes after he and Parker had been permitted to cross the sacred threshold. The late morning sunshine illuminated him like a spotlight, but it was completely superfluous, not like he needed it to draw attention. The man was handsome, incredibly so, but there was something about him that Martha didn't like. The long strap of a brown leather satchel bag hung over his broad shoulders like the arms of a lover, and an eyebrow rose at her obvious displays of disgruntlement. "You can't say that I didn't warn you, Martha Valentine." "You did warn me," she retorted blithely. "Yet you thought that you could somehow still charm your way in there," he deduced, folding his arms in a gesture that any body language expert would call defensive. Only once again it didn't match a subtly defiant sliver of amusement he held in his smile. "Either that or threaten my way in," she smirked at him. "Guess I'm not as tough or as intimidating as I once thought." "Somehow I doubt that very much." "You don't know me," she commented, suspicion in her voice. "No, I don't," he admitted. "People fascinate me now. I notice what they do, how they react." He withdrew a finger from the crook of his left elbow, pointed it in her direction. "You are very fascinating, Martha Valentine. You intrigue me. I don't understand it, but I think there's a lot more to you than meets the eye." "It's very perceptive," she noted. "Not something I'm prepared to talk to you about, but perceptive nonetheless." He all but pouted. "Oh, come on, why not? You're a stranger, and I'm not here to socialise." "That's a shame," he said, sounding genuinely disappointed. "But I agree as it happens. Your family's going through something rather unpleasant, and it's insensitive of me to flirt with you. I hope that this lead gives Amanda her answers. She needs them." "You care about her," Martha realised. "A lot." "Amanda's a remarkable young woman," he replied. "She's very talented and intelligent, and she has a passion for her craft that you just don't find every day. Working with her is a pleasure, and I hope she finds what she's looking for, because I meant it when I told you that my gallery wouldn't be the same without her. We need her there as much as she needs to be there. I need her there. She's very special, and it grieves us all to see her in so much pain." Martha couldn't help but smile. "I'll be sure to pass that along." "Please do," he said. "And also feel free to come by the gallery whenever you like. I know you don't really care for all the artsy-fartsy stuff, but it'd be nice to try and convert you, or, at the very least let you have free reign over all my books." As tempted as an offer that was, Martha said, "Yeah, I don't think so." "As you wish," he shrugged, as if he had never expected her to say yes. "Take care of yourself, Martha Valentine, and your sister. Goodbye, Henry White." With a small, rather humble smile, he turned and walked away. Martha watched him go, unable to help herself. The man certainly had a way, she had to give him that much, and it was clear that he genuinely cared about her younger sister, and was encouraging the young artist in her vocation. Sitting down on the curb opposite the entrance to the private afterlife club, she thought about how different her life might be if she simply stayed at home that day 13 years ago. In another life, she might have been a bit more open to Henry White's attention. If her path had taken another turn, one where she was single, or if she'd simply arrived in Marytown one day with no knowledge of how dark the reality truly was. and she'd not been forever changed by years of abuse and trauma. Sadly, she thought she'd never know. Some things you just don't come back from. When the other man that she'd been in the company of emerged from the club a little while later with an air of determination surrounding him, she quickly shoved down all thoughts of maybes and what-ifs. Of course, her life had not travelled along the path that it should have. Michael Parker was the walking, talking, living embodiment of that fact. It did no good whatsoever to fantasise about what might have been and what had transpired instead. Her life had turned out the way that it had, and there was nothing that she could do to change it, however wonderful the many alternatives might appear. Well, she peered up at Parker once he reached her, having to shield her eyes with her hand to block out the sun. How did it go? Have you eaten yet today? He asked, which was not at all what she was expecting or an answer to the question that she'd asked. At all. No, I guess not, she said, but that's not really. I'm hungry, he interrupted her, reaching down and offering her a hand. Martha hesitated for a fraction longer than it took to be noticeable before reaching out and finally taking it. The physical contact was immediately jarring, strange. Parker's hand felt warm and real, strong, almost gentle in the way that it enclosed her own. She allowed him to pull her up onto her feet, but then her mind seemed to go blank and she had no idea what she was supposed to do next. All she knew was that she was standing up and that she was suddenly, abruptly, far too close to a man that she'd once known far too well, in ways that were far, far too intimate. There was eye contact, blue on copper. The realization that this was the first time that they had physically touched each other in over a decade was all of a sudden a little bit too much for Martha, and she quickly pushed away, busying herself brushing stones from the pavement off her bottom and looking anywhere but at him. When she looked back, there was a hopelessness in Parker's gaze that tightened up her chest. Too much emotion. Far, far too much emotion. And it was coming from inside of her, unable to be purged. We should probably just go back to MPIA, she said, trying to do the right thing and head whatever was potentially going to transpire off at the pass with as minimal surface damage as humanly possible. No, Parker shook his head. No, not yet. Martha stared down at her feet for what must have been the umpteenth time since she arrived back in Marytown and instantly hated herself for it. As much as she tried, she couldn't deny the fact that she was struggling beneath the high levels of emotion which seemed to be following her everywhere she went. It was all too raw and too much. She sighed. I don't know how to do this, not anymore. Gentle fingertips brushed her chin, urged her to lift her eyes. She froze, unable to help it, because she was so unused to physical contact now, and because he'd stepped a fraction closer into her personal space, and because she simply didn't know how to assimilate emotionally with the reaction her body had, and because she couldn't seem to think enough to process any of it. So she simply stood there, laid out bare to the intensity of in his bright, incredibly blue eyes, unable to move, barely able to think. It should have scared her, and in many ways it did, because it had been so very long, and her mind seemed to only remember that close contact meant brutal pain, and there was a familiarity to it that felt jarring in comparison. Because it was him, and her body had also decided that it remembered him, and all of the love and tenderness that he had once bestowed upon her in abundance, and she was emotionally lost somewhere between the two powerful impulses. God, Martha, he spoke, voice barely more than a murmur. I want to be able to focus and get all this crap fixed for Amanda, but it's you. And I can't keep pretending that you being here is not affecting me, that this is not personal. How could it not be? I don't know. Let's take a bit of time, just for us. Please, Martha. That's not a good idea, she tried to shake her head, protest. It's not the right time for any of that, and the investigation, and my sister. There are more important things going on right now. It doesn't matter, he said. None of it should matter. But it does, she said. Yeah, it does. He sighed deeply. Let's run away, fuck it all, huh? Martha almost choked on a laugh. How many times had they said that to each other as teenagers? It had almost become a mantra for her crappy life and the trouble he'd often find himself in because he was simply bigger, better and more capable than a lot of his peers, and the boys always seemed to want to prove their worth by taking on the best. It never helped him that he'd also been so close to that strange Ford girl either, but he hadn't cared, because it was her. It was her and it was him, against the whole world. Yeah, she simply She simply couldn't help but smile. Yeah, let's do that. Parker's apartment was in an old building located on the outskirts of a modernised section of town that had been redeveloped into 2 separate homes. His unit was spread across the upper floor, the larger of the 2 properties, accessed by climbing a winding stone staircase at the end of the long communal hall. Forged from heavy dark oak, his front door opened into a large kitchenette that had a polished hardwood floor, swathed by a large plain black rug. The walls were painted a deep teal, the kitchen towards the back decorated in a matching tile. The counters were dark wood, their tops gleaming black marble, matching a complementing 3-seater breakfast bar that separated the 2 areas. Entering the apartment felt a bit strange, and Martha tried not to let herself think too much about what it meant, or what the fact that she was even there with him meant too. On a basic level, she told herself that it made sense to take a small, refreshing pause. She hadn't eaten anything at all since she headed back to Marytown, and Parker had been on shift at MPIA for over 24 hours, and while he was not done working, he wanted to freshen up and eat. An open set of double doors revealed that the lounge was on the left side of the reception room. It was sparsely furnished with a modern sofa and chairs, a small table, a large television set, and little else. She might have once considered the decor style indicative of a male taste, but it didn't look all that dissimilar to the home she shared with Stefan back on the Mount. Tasteful, comfortable, and yet, most importantly, functional. It was a place where you could relax after a long day, but ultimately didn't spend extensive periods of time. Shaking her head, Martha decided that she'd refrain from making her own judgments about Parker's home or making comparisons to her own. It was not a safe train of thought to think about the place that had become her haven while she was there, so far away from here. Home sweet home, he said, eerily mirroring her thoughts. He shut the door behind them and sealed them both inside. Martha suddenly felt awkward, unsure of where to put herself. It had been a long time since she'd been invited into another person's private residence, even longer since it was somebody she already had a pre-existing personal relationship with. Now that she was there, she felt nervous, which was ridiculous. She was safe in Parker's home, surely. You've got some mail, she pointed at the scattered envelopes that lay on the ground at their feet. Parker bent down, picked them up, sifting through the letters before making a noise of disgust. It'd be nice to come home to something other than bills. Martha didn't know how that felt, so she didn't say anything. Throwing the envelopes on a small table next to the door, he turned and walked into the kitchen. Martha followed because she didn't know what else to do with herself, opting to take a seat on one of the breakfast stools so that she could at least sit down and not stand there like a spare part. Opening up the tall, dark chrome refrigerator, Parker peered inside and concluded, I can do eggs, fry up some of these leftovers. I didn't really think this whole food thing through. Anything you have is fine, she says. I don't really have an appetite. Pulling out a small collection of covered bowls, he set about throwing together what, to Martha's inexperienced eyes, seemed like a hodgepodge of potato, bacon, vegetables, onion, garlic, all thrown into a big flat pan which he started heating up over the stove. Okay then. Watching him cook, she realised she could barely recall the last time she stood in a kitchen and prepared a meal, even for herself, and wondered if she ever truly had. A light snack before leaving the house she'd grown up in, perhaps. Maybe even breakfast. She couldn't remember. Her dinners had always been cooked for her wherever she'd chosen to lay her head, and she'd never been a big eater. Food was a necessity and not something she'd given much thought to, and the realisation made her feel more than a little bit disjointed. It was like there was a steel cable tightly fastened into her core, not only invisible but too durable to sever by will alone. She knew that she was ultimately getting in her own way because she was not cut out for the normality of everyday human life anymore. But she didn't know how to stop, to try and be normal, try and be like everybody else again. She wondered if she'd ever truly been normal. The unmistakable aroma of home cooking began to waft through the kitchenette as Parker, with his back turned to her, cooked up the array of food that he'd thrown together. Martha shut down all of her conflictions and tried to enjoy it, but ultimately ended up shaking her head and confessed out loud, I'm not used to this. Any of it. Parker responded, Yeah, it's been a while for me too. Not having the heart to try and explain exactly what she meant about what he'd said in response. I'm not sure, I kind of got lost there. She was not foolish enough to ever truly have thought that his life would have remained on pause in her absence. If she was brutally honest, she could probably even admit that she hadn't thought about him as often as she should have, or even really at all, not in a very long time. Life had moved on and it had changed them both. That much was obvious, but being here in his home while he cooked a meal for her, she realised that she couldn't go on pretending that it didn't matter to her either. Things were going unsaid. Too many things. Parker, she spoke, finding it strange to use that name in such a personal setting. When they were growing up, he'd always been Michael to her. But that didn't quite feel right anymore. They were no longer love-struck teenagers, or even close friends, really. She didn't know what they'd become to each other. And that was the point that she was trying to now establish. I think maybe we should have that talk, the one that you wanted to have earlier on in your office, when we were left alone together. I didn't think you wanted that conversation, he said bluntly. I didn't, she admitted, but that was before. He paused his cooking long enough for Martha to notice a slight increase in tension in his shoulders and his neck muscles. It made her heart pound in her chest and adrenaline kick in just enough to make her nervous. She wasn't sure how she should begin or again where to put herself, so she just dived in, picking what seemed to be the most difficult topic that had been causing him awkwardness. So, about Olivia. Yeah, he replied, nervously. About that. She mentioned her father to me before she left the house last night, Martha started. I brushed it off because I didn't know who she was talking about, and I suppose I was a little bit intimidated by how, well, imposing she can be. But I got to thinking about it and I put together that she's the daughter of the man that you work for? Peter Maxwell, is that right? Yeah, he confirmed. She's a Maxwell. Though she didn't grow up with her dad, didn't even grow up in this country, which you can probably infer from the accent. She only moved here 8 years ago. And the two of you were involved. You had a relationship. Hesitating for another moment, Parker stopped cooking. Martha imagined that if she could see into his head, she would see all the little cogs that made up his mind whirring into action as he tried to figure out the best way to say what he needed to say in order to answer her statement in a way that was fair and honest. In reality, she didn't need to look inside of his head. All of it was clear on his face. He'd always been such an open book. It was part of what had always appealed to her about him, his lack of any hidden malice or secrets. So you can imagine her genuine surprise when he, with a lot of resignation, finally confessed, "We had a marriage." "Oh," Martha said, stunned. "Wow, that's unexpected." Focusing on cooking again much more than he probably needed to, Parker carefully explained, "We met right after my folks died. She'd only just moved back here, and I knew Maxwell because he was friends with my parents, so they were both at the funeral. That's where we met, actually, but I don't remember much of that day." Sensing his discomfort talking about that time, Martha took the opportunity to tell him, "I was sorry to hear about their passing. They were really good people. I liked them a lot." He smiled somewhat sadly. "They liked you a lot too." Pushing down her awkwardness and own despondency about her relationship and history with Parker's family, she returned to the topic of the discussion, which didn't make her feel any better, but it was a conversation that she'd instigated, and it would be cowardly to switch topics just because she irrationally didn't like hearing it. "So, you and Olivia met at your parents' funeral?" "Yeah," he replied, casually rubbing the back of his neck. "We got to know each other after that. Bumped into each other at a bar and paths crossed a bit. It was, well, you've met her, so you have a good idea what she's like. It was a brief and very intense relationship. We got married far too fast, and it didn't last more than 18 months. He stopped and shrugged. So yeah, that's it." Martha sincerely doubted that was even remotely close to being it, or anything more than a watered-down version of the relationship between her former boyfriend and his former spouse, probably for her sake. But she didn't question it. Parker seemed to not want to discuss the nuances of his personal life in the years they'd spent apart, and she couldn't really blame him for that. She had asked, he had told her. It was as simple as that. She didn't need the details. Still, she found herself saying, "You seem to get on well." "We've stayed friends because we worked together," he stated. as if he were talking about any other person in the world rather than a woman he'd once pledged to spend the rest of his life with. Wasn't always the case, but we cared about each other enough to make it work, and well, it's been that way ever since. He laughed and shook his head in a way that was, amid his discomfort, utterly quite charming, displaying through no obvious intent of his own. Martha was convinced that he never just loved the woman that he once married. He liked her, admired her even, and he still did, even if he was reluctant to admit it. She's Olivia. Don't let her intimidate you. Of course, that was easier said than done, and while Martha was loath to admit that when and if anybody ever unnerved her, her brief encounters with Olivia Maxwell would have proven her to be a liar. The woman was impressive in so many different ways, and now Martha knew of the personal link they shared. She didn't feel any less intimidated. If anything, it only made her more impressive. In an attempt to assuage her feelings and the thin, lingering layer of tension that had permeated the room as they talked, she nodded and commented, "So you married your boss's daughter?" "Yeah," Parker said with a wry smile. "Kind of did. Though to be fair, in my defense, we were dating before I took the job at MPIA, so it's more like Maxwell who made that decision, not me." "MPIA sounds very much like a family business," she noted. "It always was," he agreed. Maxwell ran it by himself with some occasional assistance from psychics and magical practitioners that he'd hired to help him do the dirty work, so to speak. He's also a null, but that never mattered to him. Empire was his baby, his life's work. Olivia joined the team when she moved to Marytown, and then I did not long after. We picked Walsh up along the way like a stray puppy that made himself at home with us, and became what we are now. He nodded, confidence returning to his posture. "It's good work. From what I've seen, I'm inclined to agree." Parker smiled over at her, a warm, genuine smile that made her feel far too comfortable, far too happy. "Good," he said before adding, "Look, Martha, I know that this and what happened last night hasn't been easy conversations, but I'm glad we've been able to clear the air. We've been through too much to just hate each other for something that neither of us, it seems, had any control over." "I agree," she replied honestly, though she still wasn't entirely sure what she thought about everything that he had shared. But she'd asked the questions and he had answered as best as he could, and that had to be enough. It didn't matter what she felt. It didn't. Surprising her further, Parker then asked, "What about you?" "What about me?" she countered nervously. "Has there been anyone special in your life since, well, you know?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "No estranged spouses over here?" He all but rolled his eyes. "Not exactly what I meant." Martha did not reply to that, simply because she didn't know how to put into words the state of her personal life in the years that had passed since she'd been free to potentially have one again. Mostly because there hadn't been one to speak of, and she wasn't sure whether the person who could, she supposed, be considered a close personal attachment, fit into the grand scheme of things for her enough to be able to label him. She didn't know how to explain Stefan, full stop. Deciding not to push her for an answer, Parker instead busied himself dishing up their food, which looked as delicious as it smelled. Placing a plate and fork in front of her, he smiled across the breakfast bar and said, "You look fantastic, by the way. I wanted to say that sooner, but after last night I wasn't sure it was appropriate." "Thank you," she replied softly, "and, well, so do you, actually." He blushed a little, shyly rubbing his head as if he didn't see what she and at least one other very, very beautiful woman must see in him when they looked at him, which made her smile. He'd never really been good at taking compliments. Modest. Disarmingly so. "If you say so," he brushed off. "Now, eat something." They sat together in relative silence as they ate, save for Martha's initial confirmation that she thought it all tasted really good, which seemed to please Parker a lot. There was something comforting about the act of eating a meal in a home where, in spite of the awkwardness that had gone on between them, she felt safe, relaxed. She was not at all used to it, but she decided she liked it, especially with him. Before she could overthink anything, she tucked into her lunch, apparently a lot hungrier than she'd originally considered. Once she was about as stuffed as she could make herself, which sadly didn't come close to clearing the plate. She had to concede defeat and resist the competitive urge to beat Parker, who'd finished his meal long before she'd even got close. Pushing the plate away, she emphatically declared, "I'm done. If I eat another mouthful, I might explode." He laughed heartedly. Okay then. Rather than moving to clear the plates, however, he simply gazed at her. The gaze was probably too plain a word, as was simply. There was nothing uncomplicated or plain about what seemed to be happening between them again, after such a long time. Martha tried not to feel the weight of his eyes, the potential in the air that lingered between them. She didn't know how to put it all into words, and again she failed. It simply wasn't that simple anymore. Breaking the tension, Parker said, "I should get freshened up." "Yeah," she said, trying and failing not to sound disappointed. He stood up from his stool and scraped the remnants of her lunch into the bin and dumped the dishes in what appeared to be a dark chrome dishwasher. Before he disappeared through a door that led off from the kitchen at the back corner of the room, he said, in a reassuring tone, "I won't be long. Make yourself at home." "Okay," she replied, then blew an impressive amount of dejected air out through her lips after he was gone, out of sight but clearly not mind. She sat pouting at the empty door frame for a good long while, contemplating calling him back or going through there after him, but she did neither thing. To follow him, she knew would be creating a situation that she wasn't sure she could handle, let alone wanted. She would bury such irresponsible urges where they belonged and wait for him to be done. He wouldn't be long. He'd said so. Getting to her feet, she stretched, happy that the tight pull in her midsection was not as bad as it had been earlier on in the day. As predicted, she was healing fast enough for it to not cause an issue. By the end of the day, any bruising should have been gone completely, like the cut on her cheek, which nobody had brought up, also as predicted. Made her laugh that the only parts of her life that seemed to be utterly predictable were the less than favourable aspects of it. The clock kept ticking forward, the hits kept coming, even if she felt prepared mentally and physically to face them. And people didn't ask about an injury they couldn't or didn't want explaining. Marytown was a fascinating place. It truly, really, truly was. Parker's lounge was as big as Martha's bedroom back home. The window was a large semicircle of glass that let in a lot of light. 2 doors were leading off to the left, but they were closed, and she didn't want to pry. She looked around the wide room, taking in a few ornaments and photographs that were dotted along the sparsely populated shelves. A few of Parker with people she recognised, Walsh, Olivia. Many more with his family. Martha recognised his parents and felt a momentary tug of loss about their passing. She had liked the Parkers a lot, loved them in her own way, and they'd always treated her as parents should. Bad things should never happen to good people. And her Michael's parents had been some of the best people that she'd ever known. It was a great shame that they were gone. One photograph showed Parker and Olivia with another couple, a woman of which Martha recognised as his big sister Sally, who was much older now, but still as beautiful as she'd always been. Those impressive Parker genes. In another photo, she appeared with the same man, who was most likely her husband, and 2 young boys, likely her children. It was a surprising, stark reminder to Martha how life kept going, even if you weren't around to witness it pass. Stepping deeper into the room, she carefully eased herself down onto a large sofa, admiring how comfortable it was. She leaned back into the soft cushions and sighed, feeling all of the tension in her muscles finally giving up and getting the hell out of there. With her stomach full and finally feeling like she was able to relax, she felt her eyes starting to get heavy, her head even heavier. She had a brief thought that she should probably take off her shoes before she curled up into a snug little ball, but it melted away as she succumbed to the desire of her body's fatigue. Too easily she drifted off, the sleep that was waiting to catch her so deeply and utterly dreamless. Okay, so personal, very personal chapter there. Moment that I think that they both needed. Clear up a few facts about Parker's past and what he's been up to while they've been separated, and Martha addressing some of her own lingering feelings. And yeah, perhaps Michael Parker also finding a way of putting off telling Martha what he's found out. So yes, we are still to find out how she's going to quite react to that, but it seems like he decided that she needed to, take some time, and she has. So tomorrow we will continue with more Sins of the Father. Thank you for watching. as always, and hopefully tomorrow I'll have a new headset and we can have a little play around and see if the audio is better on that one. I am waiting for, I've ordered a lovely big Blue Yeti microphone that will make doing these things a lot easier, which should come like next week, but I'm getting another headset that's supposed to be coming tomorrow, so we'll see how it goes. Thank you for watching. I've got to go because my dinner's cooking. See ya.